Welcome to the California Sun Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. Remember when we were promised flying cars and teleportation devices? Well, Silicon Valley long ago decided that what we really needed was an app to summon a car. For years, the Valley has been pouring billions into solving humanity's most pressing issues, like how to get lukewarm pad thai delivered to your door, or how to swipe left to find your soulmate. Forget curing cancer or reversing climate change. Silicon Valley's brightest minds have been hard at work ensuring that we never run out of ways to make digital to-do lists. As this revolution of convenience swept the nation, other cities tried to jump on the bandwagon. Miami, New York, Austin, each vying to be the next hub of life-changing innovation, like social media apps for your pet or an AI-powered juice cleanse. But amidst this race to the bottom of meaningful innovation, there's a place that's charting a different course entirely. It's not trying to be the next Silicon Valley. It's deliberately positioning itself as its antithesis, a place where tech might actually do something more than help you procrastinate more effectively. El Segundo, California, a small beach town just south of Los Angeles, is becoming the capital of a different kind of technology. It's not about apps, it's about hardware. And not just any hardware. We're talking about hardware of war. The shift harkens back to the early days of tech innovation, the Silicon Valley era of HP and Fairchild, General Electric, and Texas Instruments, or the heyday of Route 128 near Boston. But El Segundo is taking it further, infusing this technological renaissance with a potent mix of patriotism, traditional values, and a powerful sense of mission. My guest today, Zoë Bernard, is a journalist who has written extensively on the emerging tech scene. In her recent article for Vanity Fair, she paints a vivid picture of young entrepreneurs who see themselves not just as innovators, but as saviors of American industry and national security. These are founders who work on drones, nuclear reactors, and military weapons. They're attracting billions in venture capital, and they're doing it while espousing values that seem almost anachronistic in today's landscape. Zoe's reporting raises fascinating questions about the future of American innovation, the role of technology in national security, and the cultural divides that persist even within the tech industry. Her Vanity Fair story is entitled California's Freedom-Loving, Bible-Thumping Hub of Hard Tech, and it is my pleasure to welcome Zoë Bernard here to the California Sun Podcast. Zoë, thanks so much for joining us.
Wow, thank you so much for such a warm welcome.
Well, it is a delight to have you here. First of all, tell us a little bit about El Segundo as a town. For people that are not familiar with it, what kind of place is it, which has become known in the popular lexicon of the community lately as Gundo?
So El Segundo is located very close to LA. It's just outside the city limits, but it has a very different feel. It's a manufacturing town. It's very industrial. You walk around there and it's just filled with warehouses, and it has a sort of retro nostalgia. That's how I feel, at least, when I go there. And it's located right on the beach, and it has these really deep manufacturing and industrial roots. Lockheed Martin is out there, Boeing is out there, and lately it's become this hotbed of a technological renaissance.
How much of the growth of this technological renaissance in El Segundo, which is not too far from Los Angeles Airport and not too far from SpaceX, and to what extent has that played a role in this?
I think the role of SpaceX out there has played a huge incentive for founders who've been they've been building in Silicon Valley or, Austin or Miami. And this has become the place where people who understand manufacturing have always gathered. And if you want people who have not only the technical expertise when it comes to manufacturing hardware, but people who have sort of the conceptual prowess, this is the place that you want to be. So when it comes to founders who want to build military-grade weaponry, who want to build machinery, I think that El Segundo is an extremely attractive area because that's where all of the very best of the best in this area are going to be.
One of the things that's so interesting is that when we think about the earliest days of Silicon Valley, as it started to emerge, that defense contractors played a huge role in that. Companies like Fairchild, HP, Lockheed, Varian, in those early days of the Valley were critical.
Yeah, I mean that is totally true. I think what has happened more recently is that we've seen a shift probably, gosh, I would say maybe starting in like the 2010s, where Silicon Valley very much became obsessed with software. And we had all of these consumer apps, and it was considered sort of in bad form to deal with any sort of defense technology. It was considered, that you're funding the military, and for Silicon Valley, which was historically very liberal. I think there's been this sea change, which we've kind of come full circle now.
It does seem full circle. In fact, I think at one point, as I remember it several years ago, Google had an opportunity to do some military work, and the employees revolted, and the project never happened.
Yes, yes. I think that's a moment that really stands out in people's mind. I mean, I remember I was covering Silicon Valley back then, and it was considered extremely unpopular. Now I think that if Google did the same thing, people would be completely on board.
What do you think has changed? What has changed in the culture and the values and the people? What's been the underlying root of this, do you think?
I think there's a lot of different factors at play. Obviously, the election of Donald Trump has had a big, it's played a huge role in just changing people's outlook on the world. But I also think that in the wake of the pandemic, to speak to the quality of manufacturing, I think that founders are looking to be immersed in the tangible world. And there's something really satisfying about going down to El Segundo and walking through these warehouses and seeing the stuff that these people are building. Like you can hold it, you can see it. It's not on the internet. And I think that we're having this whole shift post pandemic where people really want to work with their hands. So I think that we're seeing that. But then there's also the war in Ukraine, which has emboldened a lot of people to be like, look, if we're funding Ukraine, we're doing this for good. We obviously need good military tech. This is the reason that a lot of people are able to test out their products in Ukraine right now, and it's seen as sort of like it's a good thing. It's a very, it's a war that people can get behind, whether you're conservative or you're liberal.
The feelings about China play a role in this, both in terms of competition and in terms of what the future holds from a military perspective.
Totally. And I think that, China has always been a bit of a bogeyman for Silicon Valley when it comes to artificial intelligence and the rapid pace of innovation. And right now, it seems that a lot of founders in the Valley are very afraid, in El Segundo particularly, are very afraid of China. And they believe that China at some point is going to go to war with the United States. Some of the founders there, they were doing research on the tech in China. And the thing with China is that they can copy what we do so quickly and they can innovate so quickly. They're very good at that. So I think that these founders have a lot of trepidation around what could happen if China becomes a force that attempts to create a war against us.
We talked a little bit about SpaceX and the impact that it had on the culture of this area. Talk about the impact that Elon has had on the culture of the people that have come to this community in El Segundo.
Well, Elon is, the richest man, and he says a lot of things that embolden a particular type of person who might not otherwise have said these things. I think what we're seeing is a whole change right now in which we have kind of a battered economy. Employees' voices are no longer as strong as they used to be. And in the wake of the pandemic, during this era where it was like employees were so important and so integral to tech companies, they were doling out fancy benefits right and left. We're just in this retraction era where it's like CEOs have so much more power, and especially voices like Elon Musk. And so I think that when you have him as this pundit, it emboldens a lot of people to express their views, and he's very much behind the Segundo bros as well.
And more than just the politics of it, it's that sort of bro culture which has become extreme in a place like El Segundo.
Yes. Oh yeah. I think that I did another story this week which dealt with the proletariat revolution, and the bro is definitely a figure that's fully back in Silicon Valley culture at large. It's sort of a force that's being reclaimed right now. But it's something that's you definitely feel it when you're in El Segundo. I spent days out there reporting, and I saw maybe one or two women, one of whom was the wife of a founder who was at a Bible study that I went to. Um, and I think that Silicon Valley has always very much had a problem when it comes to hiring diverse people and hiring women. But in El Segundo, I don't know if they're necessarily going out of their way to exclude any of these people, but it just sort of it befits this white bro, pro-military, like we like guns, we like fast cars. It's a very masculine culture.
And talk a little bit about some of the people that are the founders of some of these companies.
It's a very charismatic, colorful scene out there.
Hmm.
You have Augustus Dorico, for instance. He is running a company called Rainmaker, and they're doing cloud seeding. And he's got a mullet. I visited him at his office. Every company has a huge American flag on the wall of their office. The biggest flag is at Olaf Hitchwa's company, which is a drone company that already has drones stationed in Ukraine. But they have these massive American flags. They're all really into Zins, the nicotine chewer things. So they're always like chewing on nicotine. They always have energy drinks in hand. They smoke cigarettes. They love God a lot. I went to a Bible study out there, and yeah, it almost feels very much like 1960s Americana nostalgia.
At one point in Silicon Valley, there were some articles written in the heyday, and people talked about all the Porsches and all the sports cars that filled the parking lots. You can imagine Cybertrucks filling the parking lots in El Segundo.
It seemed like people were more into like racing and race cars. They were all really big Formula One fans out there. But Cybertruck would really not surprise me. I don't know if they can afford it quite yet. They're going to have a couple successful exits.
And how successful are these companies? How new are they? How successful are they? Are they reliant on government contracts? And you also talk about all the VC money that's pouring in.
So I don't know if you can term them quite yet as successful. Definitely these founders are successful in that it does take quite a bit of stamina to raise a couple $1 million from some of the most blue chip venture firms in Silicon Valley. So these guys definitely have a unique vision. They're all quite young. Everyone that I met was for the most part in their early 20s. Are they making money yet? Who's to say? They have probably like what is it, a 7-year window when it comes to the typical venture investment. But they all have contracts. For the most part, to my knowledge, they seem to all have some kind of contract, at least with bigger Silicon Valley tech companies that already have pre-existing government contracts. So they're very much in the midst of what's happening with the U.S. military at the moment.
Talk about the role of somebody like Palmer Luckey, and really he was one of the earliest advocates of Silicon Valley getting more involved in the defense industry.
So Palmer, he built Oculus at Facebook, and he claims that he was kicked out of the company for being an advocate for Trump. I believe this was like around 2016, 2017, right. Maybe. And since then, he's gone on to form Anduril, which now has it's a company that deals with defense tech. And they have big contracts with the U.S. military, especially with regards to Ukraine. And what's interesting with Palmer is that even within Silicon Valley, he was sort of seen as an outlier. People did not like him for a while, especially around this very heated time right after the election. But it's come full circle. Everybody loves Palmer now. He's sort of seen to be, he was right all along. This is how people think of him. And he has definitely empowered a lot of this movement and made it popular.
How does the tech world in El Segundo look upon the Silicon Valley world at this point?
They do not like the Silicon Valley world at all. I think that one thing that I thought was really interesting out there is that they often make fun of people that are building software, and they consider, I would say, the vast majority of the people in Silicon Valley to be what they would term unserious people. Meanwhile, they would call them unserious people who take themselves very seriously. Whereas in El Segundo, they consider themselves to be serious people who take themselves unseriously. And I think the distinction there is that you have a lot of people, especially in San Francisco, who are maybe very opinionated when it comes to politics, and what words we should use about particular things, but they're building sort of these lightweight commodities. As you mentioned, it's apps for I think you said dating apps for your pets, which it does summarize that very nicely, where it's like a lot of what Silicon Valley has produced isn't exactly meaningful. And so I think these founders consider themselves as a reprisal to what's been happening there.
What is the nexus, as you've seen it, between these new startups, these new tech startups involved in manufacturing in the defense industry, and the traditional defense players that are in the same community, companies like Boeing and Raytheon and Northrop Grumman?
I think that there's there's obviously a long lineage there. And I think while some of these more traditional companies have just been quietly working all the while, these founders it's almost like they need an excuse to get back into this. And so they have this whole movement. They have a lot of very charismatic people. They're on Twitter. They're tweeting about their efforts nonstop. And so I think one reason that they're advocating for themselves and that they're so vocal and that they do so many, that they're happy to sit down with a journalist for a couple of days is because they're trying to attract more talent to this area and they need to make it look cool. And right now in the United States, a lot of people aren't able to do any sort of technical manufacturing. They don't work in hardware. It's becoming a little bit of a dying industry. And so they want to make it fun. They want to make it hip and they want to lure young people out to El Segundo.
Is there a talent drain from the traditional defense contractors into some of these young startups?
Not from what I saw out there. It seemed to me that a lot of these guys were so young that they don't have a ton of super technical experience yet, that they're still very much in their first innings of their career. And what I was noticing was that a lot of the founders who were out there, they were people who had already built companies elsewhere and wanted to perfect what they were building. And so they came to El Segundo for that reason. But I'm sure that they would be happy to hire people from SpaceX.
Right. And finally, talk a little bit about what you think the long-term future of this is. Is this something that's a current fad, or is this something that's really putting down roots there that you think is going to continue for a long time?
I don't think that this is a fad any more than I think a lot of Silicon Valley's most recent infatuations are fads. It could be a fad in terms of the way that NFTs were a fad a couple years ago, or
Right.
Web3 or cryptocurrency. But I do think that there's a lot of investment behind this. Andreessen Horowitz, one of the top funds in Silicon Valley, has raised an entire fund that's just dedicated to defense tech. And so I almost see defense tech being the other horse in the race in terms of what Silicon Valley is really putting its weight behind. You have defense tech and then you have AI. So I think that we're going to see this continue for a while. And there's also, there's this feeling that like Silicon Valley wants to create products that are meaningful, that people actually use, that are maybe that are more necessary and more heavyweight. And so I think that we're going to continue to see this for the next few years at least.
And do you see defense tech bleeding back into Silicon Valley?
Oh, totally. And it already is. I think that some founders are building more defense tech companies in Silicon Valley. They feel way more emboldened and the culture there has even shifted.
And to what extent do you think politics is going to continue to play a role? One of the things you write about in the Vanity Fair piece is just the culture and the politics and the big role that plays for some of these guys.
Well, politics is only going to continue to play more and more of a role in Silicon Valley. And as we are already seeing in this, in the electoral race. So I think that politics are going to be extremely important. And that's very interesting given the fact that we're seeing so much investment in Silicon Valley that's going into these companies that are attempting to have military contracts.
Zoë Bernard, her story in Vanity Fair is inside California's freedom-loving, Bible-thumping hub of hard tech. Zoë, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you so much. This was so fun.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and joining us here on the California Sun podcast. I hope you'll join us next week. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.